When teaching my college courses, I often say the active mind is the questioning mind. If you're not wrestling with some of the big questions in life, then what are you wrestling with when you're on time? Or what are you thinking about? Unicorns and puppies? I don't know. My head, Josh, is a scary place. You ever get that feeling?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's very scary.
Yeah.
Yes. Depending on how much news I'm watching in any given time.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. The outside voices that come in and influence our thoughts. I really missed the years of my farming when I was a kid, because this sounds horrible, but farming, a lot of tasks in farming are mindless.
Yeah.
So you're sitting on a tractor, you're going back and forth, and you just do it automatically. It doesn't require a lot of thought. And I would just have all these thoughts. And this is before
I think about this all the time. I'm like, what have I missed by never living a life at all like that?
Yeah. I mean, I had a big yard in Florida, for instance, and I had a riding lawnmower. And this is before, AirPods and everything. It was, you always had a voice in your head.
Yeah. Guilty. Always.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so this I was able to think, and that's what we're talking about in this series that we have for Life Talks. And it is the idea of, there are some questions about the meaning of life and existence and so forth, the metaphysical questions that a lot of people are wrestling with, and a lot of young emerging leaders are having to consider these. And so we're just having a conversation. My name is Dan. I am one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship Church in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm with my producer today, Josh Brahm, who is the president and founder of the Equal Rights Institute, a leading pro-life educational organization, and a good friend and a great thinker. So, Josh, we've been going through this. Last episode, we talked about, what is the nature of ultimate reality? What is really real? What is the nature of truth? How do we know what is true and what isn't true? What is the nature of humanity? How are human beings different than the rest of the creatures? And then what is our basis for morality? How do we decide what is right and wrong and so forth? So if you didn't listen to that episode, you ought to go back and listen to it. But today we're going to continue. And the big one that we're going to start off with is, what is the meaning of life? David pondered this. He pondered, what is man and thou art mindful of him? He pondered, why are we here? We're here. Even in the New Testament, it talks about life being a vapor. It's there for a while, then it's gone. Then what happens? You spend a lot of time on college campuses. Are kids thinking about this, or are they just kind of living in the moment?
Boy, that's an interesting question. I feel like a lot of young people today are asking big questions about, like, how am I affecting the people around me? And how can I avoid, there's a lot of, concern about oppressing people. How do I avoid oppressing people? And some of that's really good, and some of that can get taken too far and everything. But, like, I see a lot of that. I guess it depends on the people that we talk to. Of course, there are going to be some people where in the end, like, sometimes they will have a worldview. They might not be aware of the worldview until we try to make them aware of it. So if I'm having a conversation, for example, about abortion with someone, then it turns out that I can tell that I'm talking either to a moral relativist or a utilitarian. Like, the way that I train people is, I'm not talking about abortion now. We're talking about that worldview now. I'm not going to try to make you pro-life as a relativist or utilitarian. Let's talk about why utilitarianism is wrong, or why moral relativism doesn't make the most sense of the world, and then go from there. So for sure, there are a lot of people, they're thinking about these things. They might not be thinking about the categories correctly, but they are thinking a lot about worldview questions.
One of my very bad habits, and I have myriad, is
we all.
But I like to, when I find people engaged in those kind of thoughts, particularly the ones that oppress or being oppressed, those two sides. I just enjoy lobbing hand grenades into those conversations or whatever, just to see what happens. And one of my hand grenades when people get in that conversation is, well, why should I care at all how I impact other people if this is all there is? And I say some outrageous things that are probably a little bit, but what it does, it kind of shatters their comfortable worldview at that moment that I'm here to make the world a better place. And I go a couple layers deeper and I say, well, why? I mean, if you die like a dog, somebody turns the lights out, who cares? Yeah. And that's very upsetting. It's very disconcerting to them. And then I try to put the pieces back together and say, no, you're actually right.
Yeah.
But here's another way to look at it. But
so what's nice is I'm not talking to as many apathetic people now. There's not as many, like, they care a lot. They might think differently than you. Their intuitions might be different, but there's a worldview happening. So it's a lot easier now to respond to the moral relevance by like, look, we both have very strong moral intuitions. Your moral intuitions, like that it is wrong for, big capitalism, acts to affect, this group. Why? Like, you might very well be right about that. It might not just be a personal preference. It might be actually morally wrong what this corporation is doing or how they're doing it. But if it is wrong, like you and I both might agree, it's objectively wrong. It's got to be more than just you don't like it. It's not your preference. It's probably deeper than that.
Yeah, and also they usually attach themselves to a truth that is transient. So how can we say that your opinion in this moment of time is still going to be valid in another moment in time or another period of history?
Right.
And so because as truth seekers and people who believe in objective truth, we would say that truth is relevant and real and absolute for all people at all times and all places. That is one of the fundamental aspects of being objective truth. But a lot of folks do that, and when it then spirals into, so why are we here? What is my role in this universe? Am I here because of some kind of cosmic fluke? Am I here because of random circumstances?
Yeah.
Or is there intentionality to the world around us? And if so, what is the purpose of my presence here?
Yeah, which is an interesting thing because young people I feel like, and this is what we're seeing this as the last couple of generations go into the workforce, is there is a lot more care for, like, I want to have an impact. I want to be making a big difference for something. Like there's fewer, like, my dad was a software programmer. Like, God bless him. My dad was one of those guys that went into an area of work from early on and was great at it and was just trying to be a Christian light kind of in that throughout. He basically worked at the same place kind of his entire life. There are just fewer young people that want to be doing something like behind a computer for like software or something like that. They want to be doing something that's going to make more of a social impact. They care about that.
Yeah, they want to make a difference where they're at, and they don't want to necessarily be in the same place their entire life.
Yes, yes. That is no longer, it's just not a value anymore. It once was. I remember my grandfather bragging about working at the same, and I remember kind of having that kind of like, oh yeah, that would be really cool growing up. But then even in my life, after 4 years in the same ministry, I ended up resigning in protest to go do something, go work at an organization I could believe more in. Like, that just happens.
Yeah, and quite frankly, at my generation, I'm a little confused by that because I like stability, I like clarity, I like those kind of things. And then I talked to my young friends, and said, well, I don't want to do this in my entire life. Or, I had a friend who lost his job, and it was a suit and tie job in an office. And he lost his job, and every morning he got up, put a suit and tie on, went downstairs and looked for a job, but he looked for a job dressed like he was going to the office. He literally went downstairs to a desk because it felt like he was going to the office.
That's actually, they have found that to actually be really effective for certain kinds of people who have to work remotely. For some people, they have a hard time in their mind separating like their home. And so they have to dress up like the office for them to sort of mentally take it seriously or whatever.
I'm kind of that way. I gotta admit to you. Well, the great thing about those of us who are Christ followers is that we believe in purpose. We believe in intentionality. We don't believe we're here as a random act. In the early 2000s, a guy by the name of Rick Warren, who's a pastor of Saddleback Community Church or was a founding pastor at that time in Southern California, wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And all of a sudden, I was in the airport, airplanes, and see people reading
everywhere
this book
for about a year.
Yeah. And then there were spinoffs and Bible studies and so forth. But it had a huge audience among non-believers simply because I think fundamentally we need purpose. Purpose is what gets us out of bed. And an absence of purpose and an acceptance of randomness is kind of, would you not say, isn't that nihilistic at its core?
Yeah.
In that nothing matters then.
Yeah. There's definitely, and that's also a very sad, dark kind of a person to talk to. Someone who's just kind of at that point just sort of given up on goodness even happening and just kind of like, let's just.
Yeah, but it also it contradicts our actually our hidden desires or desires of art. Nihilism, I've often said, is death of art. Nihilism is the death of everything of importance, which is why people who their art reflects kind of a nihilistic attitude, like Kurt Cobain, they end up taking their life. They and a lot of young artists, very gifted, talented guys and ladies, take their life or ruin their life with drugs and escape because of this awareness that they feel like they have intent and purpose, but then why or what toward what end?
Yeah.
And so that's a big question. Again, we're not trying to answer these questions today, other than to say, for those of us who are Christ followers, then one of the things that that we can lean into, I guess, is that there is reason and rationale for our existence, and it leads to an intended and designed end or purpose. So that's an important thing. And another one then kind of applies, if we have life, we recognize life, and then there's death, what happens after death? And so a lot of young people don't like to think about this, but ultimately we all have to face it at some point.
Yep.
Do you sense that, when do you sense that people start thinking about this more?
I don't think I've got a very good handle on this. So my answer is going to be maybe partially based on like what kinds of thinkers and channels and stuff that I'm following right now. So I will say there is it seems to be growing number of young evangelicals who are questioning some of the kinds of doctrines that they grew up with, and hell being one of those is being kind of a common one. And so it seems like there's at least a lot of young evangelicals who are thinking about what should I even believe happens when we die? Exactly, like what is hell? What is the nature of it? And all of that. And so that makes me want to think that a lot of people are thinking about that. I don't know how much of a handle I have on how at what point non-theists are often wrestling with that.
Yeah, and I find it varies around the world. It's a really interesting to me.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, like so if I'm in Europe, there's more of an agnostic, atheistic view that this is all there is. And when you die, somebody turns off the lights, they pull the curtains, and there's nothing after that. In the Eastern countries, they believe you're coming back again, and that you're part of a cycle of death and life, and that that's where you get a lot of karma talk, that you'll come back better or worse based on what you sow in this lifetime. In Africa, there's a lot of different ones depending on where colonialism was strongest. But in parts of it, there's just an automatic assumption that there's a heaven, there's an afterlife, there's a good place to go. Or the other side is that you become a spirit, and then that they have a lot of spirit worship, ancestor worship. And then again, when you go to like South and Central America, the Catholicism there is so it's a lot of, well, if I'm good, and if if I've done a couple of key things, be baptized or whatever, then I'm good to go for when I go to heaven. But there's really no practical impact on their day-to-day life on that. So around the world, it varies widely. And I think that's an important thing for us as Americans to remember. I always make the joke, when you walk into an American classroom, the United States is always in the center of the map. But when you walk into Europe, European classroom, Europe is in the center of the map. When you walk into Africa, Africa's in the center of the map. It is contingent upon where you're living, and that has a huge impact on these kind of questions, values, and even faith.
And I'll say, like, I know, and I know that I'm sure you've experienced this too. Like, Americans, not just Christians, just Americans in general, have a particular reputation amongst, like, in the rest of the world, especially I think Europe, of being so insular that there are so many Americans who have never traveled outside this country, for example, and seem to them to have very little sort of perspective of ideas outside of America. And so I think we would all agree, like, we want Christians to think well. We want us to be knowledgeable and thoughtful and aware of the things that image bearers in other parts of the world are going to be learning as just by virtue of where and when they are.
Yeah. And I really think that we ought to address that in our own lives. Again, the active mind's questioning mind. What would I be like in another country?
Yeah.
Because we come across really condescending, really arrogant, really self-absorbed, really entitled.
Yep.
And quite frankly, often when I travel with other Americans, I see that on display and it makes me super uncomfortable, particularly people who haven't traveled a lot.
How does that often manifest?
There's an expectation.
Like an entitledness?
An entitledness, yeah, like like getting ice in your cup or having refills.
Not really
that's really a real base one. But others are like, well, how could you think that way? It's a condescension.
Yeah,
and then it's the constant reference. Well, in America, we, and that gets really. It's like talking to your grandpa. Well, in my day, we.
Right.
It gets a little old after a while.
Yeah.
So, so what happens after that? One of the things you mentioned was, the rejection of hell by this generation. I'm also hearing among the rising generation is an interest in annihilationism.
Yes.
So basically that line of thought says that, well, there is a hell, but it's not eternal.
Yes.
That basically at some point you no longer exist, that you burn up in the judgment or something like that.
And I did out myself on this podcast several months ago as currently being in that in that camp. Remember, to your guys' shock a little bit, that's currently the camp that I gently put myself in. I can have my mind changed. Yeah. But I am at least more likely in that camp than the eternal conscious tournament camp.
That would be fun for a future podcast, perhaps. The reality though is that there is an afterlife if we believe in the objective truth that we embrace, that begins with the Word of God, that this isn't just it. Yeah. And I think we all have to grapple with that. We have to grapple with the consequences of that. And by and large, and I think so much of this is done by media and popular culture, there is this kind of view that there's some kind of cosmic scale in existence somewhere that rewards the good and punishes the bad.
Yeah.
And so
a lot of people have that intuition.
And it almost is an intuition. And I don't know whether it is injected by our culture or it is diabolically designed by Satan to be the antithesis of the fact that we have to admit we're sinners and we need a savior.
Or is it like we have this conscience that there's some part of us that is internal, we are kind of horrified a little bit by injustice when we see it, and then it's just easy to kind of connect. Well, if injustice is objective, and then what does that mean for us? And
and that's where a lot of us struggle with the questions of the afterlife, because it is so absolute and it is so terrifying if you get it wrong. And so, like a lot of other things in our life, it's based on our relationships and our experiences. Yeah. So we don't have a problem thinking of Hitler in hell.
Right.
Or Idi Amin, or Hezbollah, the guy that they just blew up the other day. But we do have a problem with Grandma, who we loved dearly, but she wouldn't have darkened the door of the church if you put a gun to her head. And she's 3-pack-a-day smoker and drank Jack Daniels before she went to bed, and could cuss when she was angry. And so we loved her because she was a good woman. She was a hard-working woman. She birthed 9 kids and had her own garden, but she did not know Christ and didn't claim to know Christ. And we have a hard time thinking about Grandma going to the same place that Hitler did. Yeah. And so that appears to be unjust. Or we'll dig deeper, because this is where a lot of my college students end up also, is, well, what if I was born in Saudi Arabia, where literally mentioning the name of Jesus could be a potential criminal offense? Yeah. How fair is it?
Or if you're born a woman in Saudi Arabia and you're not allowed to read or go to school. Yeah. So what makes the comfort that I have as someone kind of trying to figure out what to do with all that is that I do believe in the end that there are parts of me that's concerned about injustice, and there are parts about the kind of the traditional views of hell that seem inherently unjust to me. But I believe that, assuming some version of Christianity is true, and I am, then God is going to be so much more adept at being able to truly handle this justly. And maybe grandma should be having a different experience than Hitler. Like maybe that intuition is a reasonable one, but it doesn't mean that everyone is necessarily going to heaven. Like it's different than universalism, where it was where like everyone is kind of ending up at the same place.
Right.
I'm pretty unconvinced. I'm pretty unconvinced by that.
Yeah. So that's and these are the kind of questions. And you know, growing up in a church culture, or in my case, a fundamentalist culture. It was kind of like, well, God's word said it. I believe it. That settles it. And then if you were really a good fundamentalist, you left out the I believe it, because it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. That's settled, right? So I literally heard people rant on that. But that does not satisfy the intellectual curiosity that God gave us as thinking, rational, reasonable, reasoning people. And we can't be afraid to engage people with their doubts. And that's one of the things I always want to emphasize in this podcast is we deal in the currency of truth, but we live in a world of doubts. And knowing truth and living truth and truth exists, we have to search for it. We're not creating our truth, but we're discovering truth every day. That's an important part of a holistic way of living. And if you're never wrestling with these questions, if you're thinking about these questions, then you're really bebopping through life rather superficially. And again, not everybody is supposed to be, Jordan Peterson and C.S. Lewis and all the, whatever thinker you want to put in there. But some of us are, and the fact that you're listening to this podcast lays a little bit of that responsibility on you, because you are now being poked in the brain. And you need to think.
See, this is a very good point. Okay, so I'm just going to underline that point just before we close. So I firmly believe that. I actually think there's sort of like listening to this podcast or episodes like this, there's a little bit of a blessing to curse to it, because it completely changes your culpability as a person when you know these things. Once you know that there are more things that we ought to be thinking about and taking seriously around us, then suddenly it's a bigger deal if you don't do that thing. And so, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, there's biblical principles at least implied to when the Lord gives you information and the Lord gives you direction and the Lord gives you resources, that there is a higher expectation that we do something with that. And so just the fact we were born in the United States, just the fact that we were born in this generation,
that you can walk around with Star Trek technology in your hand listening to this thing that happened in the past in HD.
While you're driving, 70 miles an hour across the planet, or flying at 600 miles an hour around the planet, you can be listening to this or any other conversation on truth. It's a complex world in which we live, and so we ought to wrestle with these questions. Well, we didn't get done with this topic list completely. Absolutely shocking as usual. So we're going to pick it up again next episode. As always, thank you so much for listening to us, and we hope that you'll tell your friends and neighbors about us. We hope that you'll let us know any thoughts you're having. I got 2 questions in the mail yesterday and this morning. Just people asking for clarifications and suggestions and offering some ideas on podcast. And frequently when I'm out and about, people will stop and say, I was listening to you the other day. And sometimes they're complimentary, and sometimes they want to, debate a little bit.
Sometimes they got poked in the brain.
And sometimes they want to poke me back. And that's quite fine. I am not above being poked. But we just want you to know we appreciate our listeners. You can always contact us at lifetalks@lifecharlotte.com. Till next time, thanks as always for joining us here at Life Talks.